guys, Robot1 and Charmander here, coming at you with a new Yu-Gi-Oh video. And in today's Yu-Gi-Oh video, we're going to be talking about something that I haven't done for a long time. And it's something that I haven't really done for a long time because I haven't really seen the game in a state where I could do this. But today we're going to be doing a video talking about the top 5 budget Yu-Gi-Oh decks in the game right now, in my personal opinion. Now, these decks will roughly cost you around £100 each, including hand traps and stuff like that. And I thought it would be a really cool idea to do this because currently right now in the game, we have a lot of things going on. We have the new maximum gold that is making cards an all-time low, such as hand traps with Ash Blossom, Impermanence, Nibiru, Ghost Ogre, and all of those. We have so many cheap decks out there that can really just compete with the meta when you really think about having those cheap alternatives now being printed in a way so people can actually play them. And I just thought it'd be a really cool video to actually talk about 5 budget decks that you guys could be potentially playing, because it is kind of annoying when you play Yu-Gi-Oh and your decks are spending like £200-300, but now you can build decks for roughly around £100 very easily. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about 5 decks that you can build for roughly £100 or under, and yeah, that's just going to be the video, guys. So I hope you enjoy. Let's actually get into it though. The first deck we're going to be talking about on this list is Marju, a really interesting deck that I personally feel is a really budget deck right now, and a deck that can be built very easily, and also that can be built in many different ways. Now, the Marju deck has been seeing success for quite a few years now, ever since I would say back in the day when we got the Golden City, along with like Gizmek Orochi and stuff along those lines, and because of that, Marju is actually something that's very easy to build now. If you look at it, Marju has actually had a lot of reprints in its decks because of the different amount of prints this deck card has, along with the reprints that other decks have that you can play this card in. Now, this deck can actually be built in multiple different ways. You can play a pure banished variant of this deck, where you just play Golden Castle, where you play Gizmek, where you play Eater of Millions, Dimension Shifter, and stuff along those lines to make your big beater on the board. You can also build this deck in a danger fashion, where you don't play any of the Golden Castle, you just play Gizmek Orochi and a ton of dangers. You can play this deck in so many different ways, and you play so many different kind of cards in it to banish a ton of cards in your deck, that this deck is actually a really easy deck to build, a really cheap deck to build, seeing as this deck has had a lot of reprints as well. Like, you've got reprints of cards like Gizmek Orochi now, where Gizmeks are like £4 at most. You've got reprints of Golden Castle Strongbird, so you can go ahead and build the Golden Castle build very cheap, and you even got reprints of the Dangers from the Megatins from 2019, and even stuff other than that can be in the game, and this deck can even run one of the most busted hand traps in the game, in my opinion, which is Dimensional Shifter. Like, Dimension Shifter in any deck that can run a Dimensional Shifter is absolutely insane, because it's basically a Macrocosmos for both players' turns, which is amazing, I might add, and this deck can also run that very easily, along with also playing other cards such as Kaijus, going second cards like Super Polymerization. Like, Marju is just one of those decks that is a really cheap deck to build. You can easily build it for under £100 thanks to all the reprints. All the expensive cards that were once expensive, like Pot of Desires, Super Poly, Golden Castle, Orochi, Dangers, have all had reprints, and there is just so many different ways that you can actually build this deck that is a very cheap option to build this format, and it's actually a really strong option in this game, because you can literally just drop Marju on like 13k, attack into the Kaiju you gave them, and win. So I honestly feel like Marju is one of the best decks in the game right now for a budget player to play, so this is just one of the few decks. Let's actually go on to another one though. The next deck on this list that I wanted to talk about is Plunder Patrol. Now, Plunder Patrol is a really cool deck and a really cheap deck to build up that as well. You can easily build this deck for under £100, finding cores on eBay for around £70, and not only is the deck actually really cheap, but the deck is also competitively viable. Now, this deck is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it has the most unique way of summoning monsters in the game currently, because all of its deck's extra deck summons rely on you from using the small shipwrights you control, such as Blackbeard, Redbeard, and Whitebeard to go ahead and summon your extra deck monsters during your turn or during your opponent's turn if you're using Redbeard or Whitebeard, and basically turning them into big ships and making them the captain of that vessel. Now, this deck basically is a control deck that uses the big ships to discard other Plunder Patrols in your hands, such as shooting cannonballs from them at the opponent's cards, with Moak discarding a Plunder Patrol card to then banish an effect monster your opponent controls, using Bran to discard a Plunder Patrol and then banish an opponent's spell or trap card they control, and using Lease to discard Plunder Patrol cards to then negate monster effects your opponent controls, and also can put more Plunder Patrols on the board from your hand or equipped zone. Now, this deck is really interesting because of that, because it has one of the most interesting ways to actually summon during the game, and can actually utilize a ton of cards outside of this as well, such as Kaijus, so you're able to get your attributes on the board that you need, such as using the Radiant Kaiju, Dogoran, any attribute you need of Kaiju to put on your opponent's board, so you're able to turn your Plunder Patrol monsters into your big ships, and it can utilize these cards very easily, and I feel like playing a Plunder Patrol Kaiju deck is actually a really strong deck this format as well, just because we're looking at decks that really just put big monsters on the board, and being able to tribute over that big monster, summon your Plunder Patrol, and then go ahead and turn that Plunder Patrol into something like a Moak or a Bran to go ahead and banish opponent's monsters is really strong. And if you ever play against a dark deck or a light deck with this deck, you're pretty much going to have a guaranteed attribute change into one of the big ships, such as Moak to banish and search cards, or at least to go ahead and negate and search cards as well. Because the Xyz and Synchro and Fusion actually do search as well. And you can also utilize a ton of other cards in this deck as well, such as Foolish Bearer of Goods to send your fusion spell to the graveyard to be able to equip Plunder Patrols from the deck, or even send the field spell to return a Plunder Patrol on the board to the hand and put the field spell into the spell and trap card zone. So I just feel like this is a really strong deck for this format. It's also a really budget deck, seeing as you can get a whole core for £70, which is actually really cheap, and it's really good for a deck like this, and it's just a really fun deck to play and one of the most unique decks currently in the game. So I really do think this is a cool archetype for you guys to consider playing and even pick up if you are looking for a budget archetype. So yeah, that's Plunder Patrol. It's really cheap, it's really fun, you can utilize Kaijus and all sorts of other cards, and it's really cheap to boot, which I feel like is really cool, being a deck that can literally just attribute manipulate with the trap card as well, and also utilize Kaijus to guarantee that you have those attributes. But that's Plunder Patrol. Let's actually go on to a different deck now. The next deck that I wanted to talk about is Paleozoic Frog. Now, Paleozoic Frog is a really cool deck that has always been one of those really good rogue contender decks that has always come out of the meta sometimes, shown its head and been like, yes, we are able to compete against the meta. And it's always been a really cool deck that has just been sitting in the sidelines and just being really cheap and budget for any Yu-Gi-Oh player who wants to play it. And the deck used to have really expensive cards as well, such as Swap Frog being like up to £8 to £10 card, Totally Awesome being a card that was like £30 at one point, but the deck has actually become a lot cheaper now, and that's why it's on this kind of budget list. Now, you've got reprints of Swap Frog in Dual Overload making the card like a £2 card, you've got Totally Awesome having reprints in Maximum Gold being like a £1 card at most. Like, this deck could not be cheaper than ever right now, and not only is this deck cheap, but the deck is actually still really good in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Being the deck that literally just turn one is able to send water from the hand, summon the Swap Frog, return the Swap Frog to hand, summon the Swap Frog again, and make it Totally Awesome by using a Dupe Frog and a Rodent Tonin, or using the Swap Frog and the Rodent Tonin, is really, really good. But the deck can also get a lot of advantage just from its trap cards alone, being able to use cards like Paleozoic Dino-Miscus that can banish your opponent's Golden Lords or Starter Piece, using Canadia to go ahead and set cards your opponent controls, which honestly is actually really strong right now, because if you do set their monster, they're unable to synchro with it, they're unable to Xyz with it, they're unable to link with it, they're basically unable to use that card entirely, and the deck can utilize a lot of other cards as well, like Trap Trick, just to be able to banish a Paleozoic from the deck and then set any Paleozoic from the deck, which is actually really, really strong. So I personally feel like Paleozoic Frog is actually a really strong contender this format. It's a really budget contender now, seeing as we got Swap Frog being reprinted in Dual Overload, and then we got Totally Awesome being reprinted in Maximum Gold. This deck is not only a really cheap option to play, but also a really cool option to play as well. So Swap Frog, Totally Awesome being reprinted makes Paleo Frogs a perfect budget deck for a lot of you players out there who love trap decks, who love frogs, and who also just love being able to summon a Dupe Frog during your opponent's turn and be like, ha, you can't attack anything but this, and if you kill it, I get to search a Swap Frog. So, guys, that's this deck. Let's actually go on to the next one, because Paleo Frogs is a good deck, but we got to talk about others as well. The next deck on this list that I wanted to talk about that is actually a really strong meta contender is Prank Kids. Now, guys, you're probably thinking Prank Kids? Prank Kids aren't actually that budget, but when you think about it, you can actually pick up an entire Prank Kids core for around 80 to 90 pounds. You can pick up the entire deck for that, which is under 100 pounds and is just around in our budget, so I wanted to add this deck to the list. Now, Prank Kids is a really, really cool archetype, guys. This deck is basically a one-card combo deck that allows you to end on boards where you can have double Raigeki and also a Harpy's Feather Duster to basically wipe your opponent's entire board. And guys, I personally feel like that's absolutely insane in a deck. Having a deck that can literally just say, I'm going to make 2 really big monsters, I'm then also going to be able to Raigeki you twice on your turn, and also be able to only do this with 1 card is absolutely insane. And not only can the deck do this with only 1 card, but the deck also has so much room for innovation. Now, when you really look at a Prank Kids deck, you're running 3 Prank Kids Roxys, 3 Prank Kids Flame Lampsies, 3 of every Prank Kid monster, maybe 1 of the Prank Kids Prank Spell, 2 Pandemonium, 3 Place, and that's pretty much it. Now, looking at that, you have so much room for innovation. You can actually run so many trap cards in this deck if you really wanted. You could run like 10 trap cards in this deck without any issue. If you really wanted as well, you could run just like 18 hand traps if you want. Like, you could literally run a deck full of hand traps and just need 1 Prank Kids monster combo off. This deck is actually one of the most spacious decks in the format right now, one of the easiest decks to build, and it's just a deck that is a really fun deck to play if you are a Yu-Gi-Oh player right now. So I personally feel like this is one of the top budget decks of the format. This is probably one of the best budget decks of the format, just for the fact that you only really need to pick up the most expensive cards, which are Place and also Doodle Doos, which are going to only run you about probably 50 to 60 pounds for the 3 of those, and then the rest of it will only cost you like a tenner to about maybe 15 pounds, and then you've got about another 25 pounds to spend on whatever you want to be able to get the rest of the deck. So guys, this deck is actually a lot of fun. This deck is really insane, and it's a deck you definitely should consider picking up as a budget option this format. So that's Prank Kids. Let's actually move on to the final deck we're going to be talking about. The last deck we're going to be talking about in this video is Virtual Worlds, a new archetype that was released in Phantom Rage and is actually already making waves in the meta. Now, this deck is actually very cheap when you really look at it. This deck only has 1 expensive card in the form of Virtual World Mayhime, which are basically an ultra rare, which is like 16 pounds, and then the rest of the deck is actually really cheap. This deck is pretty much around, probably you can build this deck for easily 80 pounds, using even with some of the extra deck cards, because the deck actually has a lot of cheap cards. The rest of the deck is common and super, and you can probably pick all of that out for a tenner, literally the rest of the core for a tenner, meaning that's probably about 55 there. But this deck, outside of being really cheap and also not having a lot of other cards that you need to pick up, like maybe the Cloud Castles, which are common, which you could probably get for about 50p's, some of the ultra rares and the extra deck, some stuff was printed in Dual Overload, so you could get it there for really cheap, but all you really need is VFD and 2 level 9 Synchro monsters to be actually able to make this deck good, because VFD Turbo is what this deck basically does. It revolves around having a Virtual World card on the board, putting multiple Virtual World cards on the board, and then just go ahead and make VFD and pass the turn. The deck is very strong in this factor, just for the fact that it can go ahead and make VFD without any issues, not caring what your opponent has, not caring what your opponent does, and the only thing this deck actually loses to is a VFD, and that can easily be resolved by running a Gossip Shadow before making the VFD, which is also a really cheap card because it was reprinted in the Mega Tins as a super rare, so that's only like a £1 or £2 card there as well. So Virtual World is just a really strong deck. It's already making waves in the LCS tournaments and on online events, and I really wanted to mention this deck in the video because it is a really cheap deck to build with only really 1 expensive card in the form of Mayhime, the most expensive card ultra in the Phantom Rage set, and it's just a really insane deck to boot, only needing a few other stable cards such as Pot of Desires, which the deck can run very easily because it can just use normal Hime to go ahead and return them to the deck whenever it's banished, and also having multiple different ways to return banished banish cards to the deck outside of that. So it's just a really cool deck, a really interesting rank 9, level 9 Synchro XT strategy that is actually a really cool deck to be playing this format. So guys, that's the last deck on the list that I wanted to talk about. This has been the 5 budget decks in the format that I personally feel like you guys should be playing. They're all really, really great and all really, really interesting in my personal opinion. So I hope you enjoyed the video. But guys, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Twitch where I'll be streaming each week. I'm normally streaming on Mondays and Wednesdays. Mondays Yu-Gi-Oh! And then Wednesdays I'm doing gaming. Currently Pokemon Nuzlocke. So I hope you enjoy that. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Rollback1 signing out. A later all.